Welcome back, Bantwana Benkosi. This is Power Talk on Power 987 with me, Mbuyiseni Ndlozi. I'm joined now for this segment by Professor Barney Pityana, who is joining us through Teams. Thanks, Prof, for your time. As always, it's a great pleasure for giving us this privilege to speak to you. Welcome to Power Talk.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation, Dr. Ndlozi. Thank you very much. I look forward to be your guest. You will treat me very kindly, and thank you very much for giving in access to your listeners.
Thanks,
Welcome.
Prof, indeed.
Thank you.
I wanted to, often we take for granted the power of repetition in a way that the sun always is faithful to its cause. In poetic terms, it always rises, and it has been rising for thousands, if not millions of years. And the things that are more sustainable in life, that really make impact, are the things that repeat, and we take them for granted because they become the very structure that structures reality. And so is the case, it seems to me, with our past. If we don't repeat it, it doesn't shine the light as the daily sun that rises. I know you may have on many occasions had to repeat what I'm about to ask, but in that spirit, I request you to just give us a brief history of how you came into becoming the first president of the South African Student Organization.
Thank you very much for that question. That really takes me to the beginning. Obviously, I think it's fair to say it starts with my relationship with Kamela Bantu Stephen Biko, with whom we were at school at Lovedale in 1963. And of course, neither of us finished school there because there was a strike and we went our different ways. We met again in 1966 when he was at the medical school and I was at Fort Hare. And we met at that time. This was a UCM conference. At that time, he was very, very involved in NUSAS. And so we were looking together at this place, I think, which was in Michael's school or something, Michael House School. And so we renewed our contact and cooperation. We'd been good friends, but we lost touch over time. So really, if I ask where it comes from, surely it must come from Pamela. And then, of course, I was at this point involved with the Anglican Students Federation and with the UCM, and he was involved with NUSAS, but these two things were actually intersecting all the time. So in 1967, Steve had been at the NUSAS conference in Grahamstown, today Makanda. He came to spend, on his way home, spend time with me in New Brighton, Port Elizabeth, now Kabecha. And we spoke through the night, basically, about his experience with NUSAS in general, but his particular experience at the NUSAS conference and the way in which he was reading the liberal dimension in the country, and which actually we were sharing notes at this point. It was then, I think, that we decided we need a different strategy from what had been the case before, where most Black people were articulate and enlightened and all of that and had leadership, found themselves in these mixed race organizations. So when we went then to Stutterheim in 1968 in July, it was then that, because that was the place where most Black campuses gathered, because otherwise NUSAS in some of them was not allowed. So at the Stockholm conference, Steve, I think it was, moved that a black caucus be formed, and he mobilized all of us, and there were a large number of black candidates there. So the idea of black people and black students articulating for themselves what their vision of their country is was shaped by the experience we had in the student movement, both Christian as well as secular, meaning NUSAS. That Black Caucus, in that same year, in December, led to a workshop being called to actually refine what these ideas are, what is going on. And Steve, almost singularly, and I must say very sacrificially, really sacrificed his studies, and he worked so hard to really bring this thing to being. He went around campuses. He called on the friendships and loyalties of people like us, wherever we were, and we rallied around him. And so the formation of SASO, South African Students Organization, with a very clear ideological thrust of Black consciousness, had its first conference at Turfloop that year. And that was how it started, really, for me. And it started from a friendship with a certain Bantu Steve Biko, and we shared a desk in Form 4 at Lovedale. And that actually has been a very enduring political friendship.
I just want to go back to Lovedale in a bit, because this is another institution which I think in the many recounts on the public platform of South Africa's political history is often forgotten. Which year were you with Steve in Lovedale?
1963, I was with Steve. You must allow me to say this, that indeed it is true, Lovedale has spawned, if you like, so much ideas and leadership. You can name it Thabo Mbeki, you can name it Chris Hani and Zola Square. Those were my seniors.
This is what I wanted to go to, is that did by any chance you, by the time you were there, was Thabo Mbeki, Chris Hani, were they at the same time in campus?
Yes, but they were Form 5. I was Form 1 when I first got there.
Intoni Form 1 galo. Just for the sake of
entry level at high school.
So you stand at 6.
Yeah, I don't know what it's called now.
And they were towards the
Form
end.
5. They were leavers, and I was beginning. And it is a time. I mean, Lovedale was a cauldron of political ideas and activity. It actually, at the age of 15, I went to Lovedale at 14. At 15, I was drawn to the ANC Youth League, and that's when I actually first formally got engaged with a formal political formation.
And I mean, by now, when you say the Youth League, the ANC was banned already. So was that the African Student Association, which was?
It was both. The ANC Youth League at Lovedale at Fort Hare also was very active. It was underground. The African Students Association, Thabo Mbeki, by this time he had left school. He was our president. And I was actually virtually in charge of the Anglican Students Association in the Eastern Cape. That's when I renewed contact with him.
Okay. And the obvious question then is, was there any interaction at any point between yourselves with Steve and these figures that whose path obviously took a very different rude as your seniors at the time? And if you could give us some anecdotes.
No, Steve came to Lovedale in 1963. I came to Lovedale in 1960. So I'd been 3 years at Lovedale by the time he came. This was our fourth year.
Yeah.
So he didn't have the benefit I had of 3 years of schooling at Lovedale. The second thing to remember, even though we were there by August that year, we were expelled. So he didn't finish a year at Lovedale and with us. But for me, this is remarkable, partly because we happened to be put on the same shared desk at school, and we became very good friends. But actually, and this was the top class in the school, and Lovedale was a very academically high level, competitive, and that sort of thing. So all of us were actually very, very clear about what we needed to achieve in terms of our academics, and Steve was really just one of those coming new to the school, and he made an impression quite quickly.
If you've just joined us, this is Power Talk on Power 987 with me, Mbuyiseni Ndlozi, in conversation with Professor Barney Pityana. Prof, the late 60s is the formation of this SASO. What position did Steve occupy at that first conference in Tafelberg?
At Tafelberg, Steve was elected president.
I see.
He was elected. He was the first president, but Steve virtually sacrificed his studies as a medical student, really, because he was president, but he spent his time visiting the campuses, and he was producing and editing the newsletter called SASO Newsletter, and in that. All of what we now see today as I write what I like, and he had a column there that he penned, and in which actually amazing ideas were being shared and coming out and talked about and debated and all of that in the context of the SASO news. Now, SASO was not banned on campuses at that time. So it was actually very, very strong in many campuses, at Tafelberg, in Zululand, Western Cape. So SASO fought here. SASO was actually very active and very strong.
I want to take you now to that sort of group of figures at the University of Tafelberg whose lives then end up in Soweto. Particularly Abraham Tiro. If you could just give us your interactions with them, your recollections of their fiery activism.
It's an amazing story that if you engage me, I will go on and on and on about it. Now, at Tafelberg, there was that group of students who were very strong. In fact, Tafelberg SRC, I was saying at the Tiro lecture at Limpopo University not so long ago, the Tafelberg SRC sponsored the beginnings of SASO using SRC funds. So they supported in as way that they could with the funds. In the first workshop, the first conference was supported by the Tafelberg SRC because they could. Many other campuses couldn't because they could actually use SRC funds with the authority of the SRC. So that shows that the SRC was almost overwhelmingly supportive of ANC. I remember so well how it was when we visited Tafelberg and we went to speak on campus about student politics. And then what then happened in 1972? Abraham Tiro was expelled because of the speech that he gave at his graduation ceremony. And naturally, people went back to their homes, wherever they are, and they really began to reflect on what is it that was going to occupy them. We did as well, because at this point, I was the General Secretary of the South African Students Organization based in Durban. We really found at our offices in Durban, students were all over the place. Most of them, they'd been dismissed. They were not quite sure about what they should be doing. So we devised two things we did. One, we worked on and workshopped a charter for a free university. We really generally thought that to have a university with impact doesn't mean that you must actually go to a place that is a campus or stone walls or whatever it is. And the idea is to churn out ideas and to debate things wherever you are. All you need a discipline of disciplined thinking and action. So we had what I still think was the most amazing document, which I never see referred to, called the Charter for a Free University, which we designed. Nengwekulu Rangwedzi talks about that with great pride. He's about the only person I've had referred to it in my memory. So we had that. The second thing we did, which SASO was very good at, was to say to students who were in their homes that you need to work where you are. You need to do community work. You need to identify where young people are. You need to work with young people. You need to build communities. You need to build young people. So whereas before our community projects were going to build schools and build clinics and go to rural areas, we are now saying that why don't you do that where you are? Because now we are no longer on campus at university. So that's how it began. And then what happened in places like Soweto, many of them, some of them, not many, some of them were graduates, and people like Mr. Matabate, Mr. Kambule, and others identified them and attracted them to support students in various ways. Some of them, like Tiro, were then appointed to teach formally. And that's how Soweto got affected. And Nengwekulu tells the story better than I can, but Soweto was really the place that was affected most. But other campuses like Mlazi, Kwamashu, and in Atteridgeville, many of the SASO people became very much active on the ground in terms of working. And of course, I must also say that that's the point at which the security police, in their devilish manner, really identified that this was a real threat to security in these communities, where there's large numbers of students expelled from their colleges and universities. According to them, they had nothing to do. So they began to identify some of the students who were very active in the leadership of this. That's when security surveillance was heightened.
I want to then go back. I mean, the Black consciousness ideology is a matter of popular understanding, and I don't know if you'd agree, but I want to take you through your interaction now in the church and how you come to coin the struggle there along the lines of Black theology. What did that mean and how did it come about?
You know, of course, that I wasn't always in the church in this sort of formal sense of being in ministry. I started life with an aspiration to be a lawyer, and I was studying at Fort Hare. I was doing law studies at Fort Hare, and When we were expelled in 1968, I was on my third year of a BA law degree. So I was on track to be a lawyer. But what then happened is that I then spent what I really think today was the best of years of my life. The 5 years that I virtually spent full-time working on student activism of all kinds, working with Steve and living in Durban and really building the bedrock of student activism in our country. And that's what we were doing. And I spent that 5 years. I mean, we were as poor as dirt, but we were working very hard. And then we were banned. 8 of us were banned, and then 8 white people and 8 black people, you know what, in 1973 by the apartheid system. That then took me back to my home in Port Elizabeth, because I was banished, as it were, to Port Elizabeth. And I was on house arrest in Port Elizabeth. So I was living in a prison in my own home. And it is at that time that I then had it in my mind that I must actually finish my law studies, which I did articles, and then I finished and qualified in 1976. Now, the point I want to make is that I started that way, but in fact, much like so much else, I had a very strong critique of law and lawyering in my country at that time. I really got to a point where I really didn't see myself formally, as it were. I mean, in that time, I spent spells in jail that probably would be about 3 years or something like that, and then 1 year here, 6 months there. So I was detained without trial so many times. But I came to an understanding that although I was on the verge of being admitted as an attorney, I was having doubts that that's where I wanted to be. Believe me, that is then that the idea of ministry and the church became attractive to me. And of course, in the SASO days, we formed a partnership with Black Theology through the UCM. And I was also part of that thinking, and the project on Black Theology, which Sabelo Ntwasa was the first to be part of, was really something that had deepened in me a great deal. I suppose through these 5 years and 3 years of banning orders that I went through, I mean, another 5 years of banning orders. And then I then decided that, you know what, and I read a lot, and I followed Oliver Tambo, who himself was aspiring to become a priest in the Anglican Church. I was inspired as a 16-year-old at Lovedale by Z.K. Matthews, 15-year-old, in fact, Z.K. Matthews, who came to speak to us as the SCA. So a lot of my influences came to light. And so although at the time I was saying, you know what, I'm really attracted to theology as a philosophy, you know what I mean? And I wasn't quite sure that ministry was really what I was aspiring towards. And then in 1978, I had to go to exile. In 1978 as well, I got a banning order that forbade me from practicing law or being in any place where law was practiced. So that really put paid to my formal idea of being admitted as an attorney, because the Minister of Justice actually dispelled all of that with a new banning order that actually meant that I couldn't be admitted, I couldn't practice, I couldn't have anything to do with law. So I went to exile. Right? To some extent, that was a trigger for my going to exile. So went to exile. Initially went to Lesotho, and a bishop at the time, Desmond Tutu, who was General Secretary of SACC, called me and said, you know what, if you like, have organized a scholarship for you at King's College London. So I was then, and he said, you can study whatever you like, but you're welcome at King's College London. So there am I. Went to King's. I wanted to renew my interest in philosophy. And so there am I. I went to King's and I read theology, majoring in philosophy and Christian doctrine. And I spent 3 years of an exciting life, something I never had in South Africa. To be in a university in my later years, and that in the end, that's what led me to ministry. So I offered and made myself available for ministry, and then I went to Oxford and trained for ministry, and I was ordained. That's my journey.
Yeah.
So Black theology was very much part of that. And once I had a very solid training in theology and philosophy, where I was testing all of this, so it became a passion for me, and that's what I was really articulating in my writing, in my intellectual work, etc. In the end, I did at UCT, which, by the way, I studied in London. I did at UCT a PhD, which was basically examining theological method, looking at Black theology, traditional African religions in Brazil, as well as Black theology in South Africa. So it was for me, it was very, very exciting, where things seemed somehow to be coming together in my intellectual aspirations that I had been working on over a long time.
But what are the central tenets then, if you were to conceptually just give us a 101 introduction of Black theology?
The essential thing is with Black theology is that God is God, and God is not articulated according to the wants and wishes of whoever. And if God is God, Black people are correct in trying to understand God from their context. And that God speaks to them in their context, in the environment in which they are. God speaks, God talk, if you like. God speaks to them in that context, and they have a right to articulate what that message of God is to them. And I've always been very reluctant to start Black theology by denouncing what colonial theology has given us and racist white theology, because at the end of the day, you get stuck and you don't move. So I was always keen that we articulate for ourselves who God is and what God is about for us and in the context in which you are. So in order to understand that, you've got to understand your environment, your social environment, your history, your culture, and all of that, your language, in order to begin to hear the God language speaking to you in your context in which you are in. That's how Black theology began to speak to me, so that I cannot speak a theology that is alien, that is European, that is English, that is whatever. Because at the end of the day, the people I speak to have got everyday realities that they are wrestling with. And the God I present to them doesn't speak to them and to their situation. So Black theology for me enabled me to situate my idea of God in the realities and the context of people that they are wrestling with every day.
I will come back to that religious theme of BC, but I mean, you would obviously, maybe I should do it now, just the first part. What is the relationship to Black consciousness itself? If you could explain between Black theology and Black consciousness. Is there a relationship? If so,
yes, there is.
What is it?
there is a relationship. I did write a paper that was published on Black consciousness and Black theology. So that's one of my early explorations of this. The idea is that you cannot have Black theology unless you have a Black consciousness. That's what I mean by context. So you must be aware of your context. You must articulate your context. You must be aware of yourself in terms of who you truly, really are, before you can begin to insert a God dimension to your common life, your ordinary life. If you don't have it, you will take in everything that Europeans and Americans and everybody else is imposing on you, and you will become a fake theologian, I think. Because all you will be doing, you'll be articulating other people's experiences of God and make it yours. So I always said that before you can do Black theology, you must have Black consciousness. Because theology, by its nature, is your articulation, your understanding, your expression of God whom you experience. And you will never be able to experience that God unless you are true to your own context and your own experience.
Okay, if you've just joined us, Bantwana Benkosi, this is Power Talk on Power 987 with me, Mbuyiseni Ndlozi, on this 1976 uprising anniversary of June 16. I'm on the line with Professor Barney Pityana, one of the pioneers of the Black consciousness movement. I'd like us, Prof, to go now to 76. You were university students. You could, of course, juxtapose the levels of consciousness that you had as a high school student at Lovedale, that you were able at that level already to access complex explanations of the Black condition and of the colonial condition. At the time, of course, you mentioned figures like Z.K. Matthews, Oliver Tambo, who for you were important, and the obviously Congress ideas. But the 1976 generation was charged by the ideological orientation that had been pioneered by yourselves and Steve, and seemed, to appeal at the center to a certain sense of pride and self-sufficiency. And we're looking at 14-year-olds, we're looking at 13-year-olds, up to 18-year-olds. Firstly, the historical movement reaching high schools. How did that come about? And your sense of that youth. I'm sure you had a chance to have gotten direct interaction with them. If you could just tell us the reception of the Black consciousness ideas and how for them it reignited or ignited the fire to become the firebrands that they were, up until to the extent that they were willing to lay down their lives, young as they were.
Let me say this in all honesty. At 1976, I'd been banned and under house arrest in Port Elizabeth, as it then was. I was virtually living with police day and night. At this point, I was actually an article clerk in a firm of attorneys in the township. So I would actually go when I go to work, walk to work. I had police following me everywhere I get to work, I come out of work, etc. And I had to be home between 6 and 6 and throughout the weekends and public holidays. I believe even to this day that I didn't need to do anything. The conscientization of that community of Port Elizabeth was being done by just my presence in the township. Even today, I met the other day some young people who were saying, what we know about the politics of our time is that we had Barney Pityana, whom the police were afraid of, and they were following him and afraid he couldn't talk to anybody. If you talk to him, and then the police would be onto you in no time. So from my perspective, living in New Brighton, in a sense, I didn't have to do anything. You just have to read Nkuseli Jack's book and others during that time. Steve, on the other hand, was in Ginsberg. He had the fortune and the insight to be involved in projects as a band person, and he was able to attract many of his fellow students who had been medical students, and some of them had qualified, who really helped him establish the Black community programs in King Williamstown. So for him, there was a different experience, but there was a convergence of very many of the Black consciousness people, Malusi Mpumlwana, Peter Jones, and others, and who really worked on the ground in the King Williamstown area. And Steve had set up Black community programs there with the help of Bene Kwapa. If you go to other places, in Soweto, Aubrey Mukwena and Onkgopotse, Abraham Tiro, and many, many others got involved in other forms of activities. Now, if you talk to Rangwedzi Nengwekulu, who was in Johannesburg at the time, for him, the work that they were doing was to be available to talk to and support and enable young people who were anxious and trying to understand the situation in which they were in. So they started by supporting the Soweto students' representatives, I think it was called SSM, if I'm not mistaken, to form study groups with them and to enable them to self-organize. So Nengwekulu would say that all we needed to do is to be available and open. Whenever we were needed, we were available. But if we were needed, young people wanted to do their thing, they didn't need to come to us. So the amazing thing with that, how it worked, is that young people in Soweto didn't feel that they needed permission from anybody to do what they needed to do, what they felt was necessary to do. But they were enabled to be articulate about their situation in a critical way, to say that the situation we're in and the environment we're in, we cannot allow it. So the sharpening of the intelligence of young people was more important than what they eventually did. And I think if you were to ask Nengwekulu, even Aubrey Mukwena, now deceased, and Onkgopotse Tiro, now deceased, if you were to ask any of those people, they'll tell you all we did was just to be present and to be open to talking to young people who came to us. And they did come to us in various stages. But what we cannot do, or even assume, is that we instructed young people to organize themselves to go on strike at a certain time. But actually, all of that was the young people's doing. And we cannot say that we are responsible for that, because I think that would be false.
What kind of young people were these? I mean, if you were to just give a sense of their generational persona, I mean, the decision is unparalleled in the history of the struggle. 1976, just the sheer age, from a perspective of the world, these were children. Literally going on to confront the system in the way they did. And since then, high schools in South Africa were never the same.
Absolutely.
What about them as a generation, would you say? Because all of us look to Black consciousness to explain their actions. Is there something more?
I think so. I happen to believe that without that intellectual work that Black consciousness provided by setting and context, the freedom that they felt to be free to think, to be free to act critically in their environment, identified among the young people that time. And the names are common knowledge in Soweto. The presence of teachers like Onkgopotse Tiro, and he was not the only one, by the way. There were a few others who were teaching in different places of that generation of 1972. So for me, they were, you're right, they were extraordinary young people. They were extraordinary young people because they were focused on their education. They were focused on the quality of their education, because all of these were hardworking, very, very able, brilliant young people who really were not going to compromise their educational space. And it is no wonder that the issues that were of value to them were about their schooling and their education and the conditions and the circumstances and the possibilities of succeeding in their education in terms of the imposition, in this case, of an Afrikaans language for half of the subjects that they were studying. And most of them were matric students. Some of them were even junior students at that time. And I think their sharpening of their consciousness was a response to the band education system that was being imposed. By the way, band education system had been there for much longer than that. It had been there since 1955, for example. But certain things were gradually becoming intolerable. I think the trigger was the imposition of the Afrikaans language, and people suddenly realized that there were no Afrikaans teachers. Teachers were not trained to teach in Afrikaans, and this language we don't speak, we don't hear in our environment where we are, and really, my interpretation at least, is that much more than politics in that sense. It was much more about their education, and education is political.
And so for that generation, the point of departure is precisely their intellectual investment, their dedication to wanting to be educated. This you don't think is precisely what Black consciousness itself had in a way propelled them to do, to take their education for themselves, a certain sense of pride in what I'm being taught, what I'm being made in what I'm being taught.
Obviously, it is not an accident that Black consciousness started at universities. It is not an accident that it started in Black universities, that the system must have thought that we are creating particular universities that were going to be compliant. It began with a critique of the environment where Black students were at, and trying to find explanations as to why are we where we are, and begin to say, how do we move forward? And part of that critique, by the way, was also the critique that said, we are at a point where, at this point anyway, for nearly 20 years, the sort of major organizations had been banned, and efforts had not worked. And the critique was beginning to say, what is it about that struggle that has not worked? And this is something that I often say to myself about, in particular about ANC, but it's just the same with BC, is that we are hostile to the idea of self-critiquing. Providing ourselves with processes of thought and critique to dare to say we can do better. We can do better than we did, and that is no judgment on whoever was there before. But it is the time that we're in that is beginning to open up to us possibilities of that we may not have appreciated at a certain point in time. So that's what we did. We had the freedom to think as students, university students, to say that the idea that you can expect white people to deliver liberation to you and you sit somewhere at the top and you take all instructions from white people, and that's what we perceived was happening anyway. And meanwhile, you are alienated from the vast majority of the people you live with and you come with. And instead, it appeared that your strategy is designed and determined by others, among them, who are beneficiaries of the oppressive system.
And in a sense, if I could push a little bit, because I now want to enter the present, the apartheid system's violence, its crushing of 76, it's actually worse than 55 and 1960. I don't imagine the proportions of violence that it unleashed on the day were comparable to not only because these were children, unarmed, not associated with any armed wing of any organization, totally independent as an organization, yet the magnanimity of violence against them
children,
had not been seen before. What about them that apartheid hated so much? I mean, in comparison to 1960, 1955, you know, I mean, the Freedom Charter guys get charged and there are all types of activities. You don't see the sort of unleashing of massacres and administration of massacres in the way that you do see unleashed on the 76 generation. Hundreds of kids die on that day, worse than it had ever been, including Sharpeville.
Yeah. I was just about to say, save for Sharpeville, of course, where 69 people were known to have been brutally killed, direct shooting at them and destroying their lives. I want to say, you know, we could sense over time, gradually, in the run-up to 1976, of course, looking back, we saw Mthuli Kashedzi being thrown in Germiston Station onto the front of an oncoming train. We actually experienced, of course, there were people dying in detention at that time. At that point, I think, before Steve, Steve was the 42nd person who died in detention. We actually saw gradually many of us being killed in detention. I mean, I told you that the scrutiny and the vigilance of police became heightened, certainly in the time that I was banned and we were banned, etc. But you're quite right. It had never been against children, 13-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds. It had never been such direct brutality on children, by any definition you could think of. And I think that is when the apartheid system surrendered whatever high ground it might have had. And it could never justify what had happened to those children ever. So the apartheid system, I think, met its match with those children who were children who actually were killed. Of course, there was another session in 1984, 85.
Yes.
When children were killed, we even had to have a children's conference sponsored by the United Nations and the World Council of Churches in Harare in 1985, because the idea of a system killing its own children for no other reason than that they are expressing and demonstrating against the system that is crushing them was unheard of. So whatever morality apartheid could ever have, it was totally done by 1976 and following.
Okay, it's 1000 hours here on Power Talk. We are still with Professor Barney Pityana. When we come back from the news, we're going to try critique our present with the important ideas of the movement that brought about 1976. We'll look first to the actions of the current state and its relationship to the children, then go to a critique, as it were, of the education system and our religion today. It's 1100 hours here on Power Talk. Welcome back, Bantwana Benkosi. We are still with Professor Barney Pityana, who is one of the preeminent founders of the Black Consciousness movement here in South Africa. Prof, I wanted to maybe move to a critique of our present. And it seems to me at the center of Black consciousness is the idea of self-sufficiency that must obviously ground self-pride. And from that point of view, what would you say has been our government's performance or society as a whole over the last 30 years? Have we built as much as possible truly self-sufficient communities? And if so, what are the signs to that effect? If not, what has been wrong to drive our people into those modes of self-sufficiency that bring about pride in themselves?
Thank you very much for that question, Mbuyiseni. Let me just preface it by saying that the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu used to say, you know, what we need in South Africa in our day is a good dose of Black consciousness. What Black consciousness did to people is to give Black people especially the idea of Black pride, the idea we're Black, we're proud, we're sufficient in ourselves, and we are capable of actually designing our world in order that our world can serve the best of us in the best way that is possible. I've often said myself that what I bemoan most about our current circumstances is what I really can only interpret as there's just quite a lot of hatred of Black people in our governmental sectors. People who have power and authority to do things that could actually improve the lives of our people, instead have used public resources to throw into their own lavish lives and lifestyles, and doesn't put in mind the idea that we are where we are so that we can make the lives of our people better. That's the first. The second thing is that there's a lot of denialism, the idea that we forget who we are, where we come from. We forget that we are where we are because some of our people, and many of them young people, have sacrificed so much to place us where we are. And we are not there by our own might or strength or whatever it is. We are where we are because people actually willed that we be there to improve their lives. Having said that, my own feeling is that, and amazingly, South Africa is not a poor country. It's not a country that cannot actually enable what I think politically was done, especially by the ANC, is this rhetoric that says, and Mandela was very good at this, that basically says, ANC will do it for us, ANC will do this for you, the government will do this, the government will do that. So what we did, whatever motivation was behind that, we began to say to people, you don't need to do anything, the government will do it for you. And therefore, we did not use public resources to empower people. When President Mbeki was in government, he desired so much that the thinking of South Africa should be about how to create a developmental state, a state that is about people and by the people, and that the people can actually have the resources. So the state enables the humanity of people. What has always been in my mind is Pamela's idea that at the end of the day, true politics is about recovering our true humanity. And if we act and behave as if we're not human because our humanity is tied up with the humanity of others, if we deny the humanity of others, then we deny our own humanity as well. So it seems to me, and much of it in more recent years, we have really lost our humanity, our sense of being human in South Africa. No wonder where we are today. And we continue, it seems to me, even now, we continue to behave towards the poor and the needy. And frankly, in our country, we shouldn't have as much unemployment as we have. We shouldn't be having poverty of the kind that we have. We shouldn't be having cities and townships that are dilapidated and broken in the extent that we have done. And that is because the people who had the power didn't have the pride to say, whatever the Boers did, we will make it even better. So they broke down because they don't have pride in themselves to say that we cannot do any worse than the Boers did when they were running this country for 50 years. I cannot, as a Black consciousness thinking person, I cannot but say that for me, that is as treasonous as anything treason can be.
And what would a Black conscious state look like? Professor?
Sorry. I think a Black conscious state would be, no, let me first say, to the best of my knowledge, Black consciousness never articulated an ideology of government. Black consciousness never saw itself as an ideology that is going to be the means by which government shapes and is shaped by it. Black consciousness was an ideology of the empowerment of the most needy and poor people in our country, at least. And of course, that is the weakness of Black consciousness, that it never articulated, as far as I can think, an ideology, and that was actually intentionally so, by the way. And when in the latter stages of Black consciousness, when people tried to really ideologize Black consciousness in that way, all it did actually, it created divisions of the kinds that we saw when BCM came to be articulated in exile. So having made that point, let me then say that the way in which I imagine, and I can't use any better word than that, the way in which I imagine government under a consciously Black conscious government system would be the one that actually puts people first, would be the one that is on the ground and turns around the lives of people, would be the one that empowers people to improve their lives, where resources are being used for the people, where language is a language that is an empowering language, where action and government activities would be the ones that empower people. So if that's anything like what government would look like, I think we would be in a very different place today than where we are. I cannot imagine that a Department of Social Development that we have can treat the poor and the elderly in the way in which we get. I cannot imagine hospitals in our country being unable to treat women giving birth on the floor in the corridors of hospitals. So you can go on and go on. I mean, that's not the language I wish to use, but I want to say that we can do better than what we are doing.
And finally, two sets of questions. One relates to the place of the youth today. It's almost 50 years since 1976. Is that neglect, that sense of the youth is on its own, something that is part of the present experiences of young people? And what would be Steve's message today? What would be your message today to a youth whose major sentiment is that it feels neglected? Hence the sort of so-called high levels of political apathy. They look at politics as an avenue that no longer carries their collective salvation or collective freedom, but as an avenue of self-perpetuating careerism and self-interest. That's my sort of first question. I guess maybe I suspend because my second one has to do with Black theology and its critique of our spirituality today. Let's start with this state of the youth today.
Mbuyiseni, let me say where it begins, where it began with us as young people in our time, where I think it begins today, is by the state paying attention to education and training of young people. If you don't provide an experience of education that is life-making and life-changing for them, if you don't make it possible for schools to be environments for intellectual development and disciplined thinking, you wouldn't be able to get whatever else you want. If you have, as it is suggested, 3 million of our young people in our country today without schooling, without training, without skill of any kind, and you have a sense that this is just a statistic that is being articulated, and instead there is no program that I can think of that is really put out there to take in large numbers young people off the streets and training. I must also say, as a university manager and educator myself in my time, that the universities in our country have failed our students. Universities continue to fail our students, in that, notwithstanding the resources that have been put at universities, notwithstanding the research that is output that is coming out of universities, once our young people get out of universities, they get lost. The idea, just the concept of unemployed graduates is very strange to me, because with it means that you've got people who are graduated, who have graduated, who understand themselves to be of no benefit to themselves and the communities that they seek to serve. That is a failure of our tertiary education, frankly, and something we need to really come to terms with what it is that, with all the investment that has been put into universities, the growth of universities in our country, which is commendable, but still at the output end, I don't get the sense that we have enabled young people to really become the kind of people who have ideas and excited about the world and the life in which they live in. So for me, that's where it starts. I cannot think it is possible to have a world that is really serving young people in our time, unless you stop this thing of saying you must pass your grade 12 in a particular way and celebrate and all of that, and then people get thrown in their situation and they get forgotten.
And finally then, Prof, the spirituality, Black theology's major message under apartheid. What would you say the measure of our spirituality as a country is?
Mbuyiseni, I have to say, as a theologian and as a priest, I have to say that is something that doesn't give me a great deal of pride about South Africa. I think South Africans mistake the ritual, the opportunities that we have at random in our country to practice our so-called religion, to dance and sing and pray and wear uniform and do all the visual things that spirituality is about. But we forget the inner sense of what spirituality is about, because it's about building our moral character, building our sense of humanity, building our sense of God in our world. But God is not just up there. God is with us. That is why God, who's come to dwell among us as Emmanuel, it matters how we deal with each other and one another. All the other things are enablers. You know, your praying, your ritual, your attendance at church, your offices of ministry and others in church are enablers of that. But at the heart of it has got to be your sense of God living and working and being among us, and how that affects your approach to life, your approach to your neighbors as well. So I find it very, very difficult in our country, the sense of morality. If I may move out of it and say, the world as we live it today is a world that somehow has subverted morality and moralism, and the language that is being used of the importance of a moral being, the importance of respecting the humanity of others, the importance of valuing and respecting the humanity of women like you value yourself, children like you value yourself. So at the end of the day, I sometimes think it is worth very little that we go to church, we pray, we praise God and that sort of thing. Okay. Where in fact our lives are not affected by godliness.
Yeah.
And that's really how I feel. That's how you see a society that's spirit-filled and that's spirituality in our public realm. Is not so much, although that is there, in my view, it's not so much what we do when we're in church. It's about what we do and what we understand of ourselves and our neighbor. And that's what God tells us. We will not do that unless we actually believe God is in our midst. God is not up there sometime when we die, whatever theology of God you have. But we've got to come to understand that the God that we worship is the God who is present with us.
Professor Barney Pityana, thanks deeply for creating time and sharing your thoughts on the 49th anniversary of June 16, 1976, here on Power Talk.